I'm just going to croak my way through this this chapter. All right, so we finished chapter 1 last time. Thank you. We finished chapter 1 last time, talking about the different tribes when they came into the promised land, and they split up and everybody went to their own land, and then they had to conquer. They had to get rid of the Canaanites who were still in their lands. Mm-hmm. And they, in trying to do that, Judah did very, very well, and Judah was wonderful. And that is typical of Ralph. Remember, Ralph is the name that I give to the guy who wrote Judges and Samuel and Kings. We don't know what his actual name was. We know that he was in the Babylonian exile, but we don't know what his name actually was. But he likes Judah because he is really expecting the Messiah, and he's very much focused on the Messiah who's going to come, and he knows the Messiah is going to be from the tribe of Judah. So Ralph is very fond of Judah. So anytime you see Judah showing up, usually it's going to be, in Ralph's writing, usually it's going to be, yay, Judah, good. Mm-hmm. Dan, Benjamin, not so good. And these are the things that we're gonna see popping up whenever we see Dan mention the tribe of Dan. We think idolatry, that big golden calf up in the northern kingdom that they've got set up in the city of Dan. So we think bad. Same with Bethel, we think bad idol worship. Okay, so chapter 2. The angel of Yahweh came up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I made you go... Ooh, what version am I reading? Okay, let's do the New King James. The angel of Yahweh came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I led you up from Egypt. I brought you to the land which I swore to your fathers and said, I will never break my covenant with you. Okay, who's this angel of Yahweh? I'm sure somebody's heard a sermon on this. Anybody know who the angel of Yahweh is usually?
Messenger? Gabriel?
Yep, can be Gabriel. It can be. Angel is just our word for messenger. We get it out of the Greek New Testament, angelos, is the word for messenger there. So this angel of Yahweh is the messenger of Yahweh. It's not necessarily a specific figure. It's more like an office. Think of it more like an office. He's a diplomatic go-between between God's counsel and the world. And we'll talk more about the counsel of God in a couple of verses. But this messenger of Yahweh is a diplomatic office goes between. So it can be fulfilled by different figures. It can be fulfilled by angels. There is also quite a bit of speculation that it can be fulfilled by God himself in the form of Jesus. Sometimes they attribute this messenger of Yahweh to being actually Jesus. Christians will. In this case, most of the Jewish commentators think that this messenger of Yahweh is actually a prophet or Phinehas, the high priest, because they can also, human figures can also serve as a messenger of Yahweh. Sometimes we see, quite often it is a human figure, but alternatively it could be that mysterious theophany figure, the theophany, the seeing God face to face, having a direct encounter with God. So who we would call Jesus. And we do see that in other places. It's significant that he's coming from Gilgal, because Gilgal is where the Israelites made their covenant when they entered in the Promised Land. And he's coming to Bochim, which means the weepers, the ones who are weeping. The Septuagint says that he came to Bochim, Bethel, and the house of Israel. And there's actually an oak of weeping near Bethel. So it may actually be that he's talking about a very specific place. All right, verse 2, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. You have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? This is what Yahweh thinks about the negotiations that the tribes get into, saying, oh, well, we'll just put you under tribute. We won't kill you. Yahweh is responding to that. Say, you guys disobeyed. I told you to do something, and you decided to negotiate instead. Therefore, I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side. Their gods shall be a snare to you. So it was, when the messenger of Yahweh spoke these words to all the children of Israel, that the people lifted up their voices and wept. This weeping at Bethel that they're doing is the same thing that they're going to do at the end of the book in Judges. So like in the first chapter where we were bookending with things like God saying, the first words that God says in the book are Judah first, and the last words that he says in the book are Judah goes first. This is another one of those things that is bookending the book, this weeping at Bethel that the people are doing. Verse 5, and they called the name of that place Bochim, and they sacrificed there to Yahweh. And when Joshua had dismissed the people, remember this is a recounting of everything that happened, a summary of everything that happened in the book of Joshua. The children of Israel went each to his own inheritance to possess the land. So the people served Yahweh all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of Yahweh which he had done for Israel. Wow, what a happy ending. People served Yahweh all the days of Joshua. That's great. It's a little bit confusing how an entire generation is so happy and righteous after spending 40 years failing miserably, complaining and wandering around in the desert. The first generation may have died out. We know that they did. But there's plenty of things that are done wrong by this generation, Joshua's generation, in the wilderness, like the golden calf was in their generation. Arguing with Moses, the hitting of the rock story, that all happens with this generation that served Yahweh all the days of Joshua. So this it's kind of recapping in the book of Joshua when everything was good and the people of Israel are serving Yahweh and everything is perfect. Well, now we're going into a not so good picture of them. Okay. Sorry, just kind of really struggling with the voice. Verse 8. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, servant of Yahweh, died when he was 110 years old. Servant of Yahweh is an administrative title. We see Moses is the servant of Yahweh, and that's transmitted on to Joshua. There's other servants of Yahweh, Caleb, Samson, David, all servants of Yahweh. It's applied, what's the word? Posthumously to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're all referred to as servants of Yahweh. And of course its climactic use is in Isaiah, suffering servant. Okay, since we've already got this death in Joshua, the book of Joshua already told us that he died. And the writer of Judges already, he clearly has Joshua in front of him, if he's not the same author. Why do we need this to be told again? Why tell us about the death of Joshua again in order to start this narrative? Any ideas?
No. It's important. Because he was, a great leader. And it's going to be he was important, and then who comes after him?
Yeah. That is what some commentators say, that it's actually to say, Joshua was really good, and to emphasize that he was really good. Things didn't fall apart and didn't start falling apart until after he was dead. So until he was dead, everything was great. But then when he died, everything fell apart, and because there was no clear leader. It could also just be literary technique. Remember that very first verse that we did in chapter 1 made it sound like this book was a sequel, was intended to be read as like a sequel to the book of Joshua. So in that case, it would be a literary technique to connect the book before to this book here. And it may be a signal that the book of Joshua and the book of Judges are intended to be read as a single unit. And possibly that they even have the same author. I don't actually have a theory on whether or not Ralph wrote Joshua because I haven't looked at it closely enough to be able to see, but it's pretty clear that he also wrote Judges in addition to Samuel. Okay, verse 9. They buried him, Joshua, within the border of his inheritance at Timnah-Heres, in the mountains of Ephraim, on the north side of Mount Gaash. Timnah-Heres is a portion of the sun, like not sun in the sky, sun, child. It's by Shechem. Or it could also be Timnath-Serah, because of a grammatical thing that happens in the Hebrew. If it's a grammatical thing that happens in the Hebrew and it's actually Timnath-Serah, then it would be the leftover portion. Like when they divided up the land and there was this leftover portion. So that could be where they buried him, in the leftover portion. It was just community land because it was left over.
Is that significant? Why would they bury him in the leftover portion and not in somewhere more significant?
Well, it says they buried him in the border of his inheritance. So if he had an inheritance, specifically, if he was specifically given land, because remember Caleb was specifically given land that he asked for. So it's possible that Joshua also asked for a specific place and it fell in the leftover portion. So his inheritance was in the leftover portion apart from what everybody else had in their tribes. So it could be that. In the mountains of Ephraim. So it's a thought. There could be significance to it, but if there is, I don't know exactly what it is.
Should print out a map of the Old Testament so we can see where these places are.
I can do that actually. Actually, whether we're here or at Mim's house, there's a TV in the room, so I can actually just put it on a little flash drive thing, a big map of Israel. So yeah, we can see where the different places are at.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, it gets interesting when you start some of the things that end up being geographically significant. Okay. Verse 10, when all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them that did not know Yahweh, nor the work which he had done for Israel.
This is the third.
Yeah, this is the third generation then. This wording, I recently listened to a Hebrew rabbi named Haim Angel, I think is how you pronounce it. Angel, Angel. And he read this much more fluently than I would be able to do in Hebrew because my Hebrew is horribly underused right now. But when he read this, his whole class went, oh, that's like this other thing. Because you don't see it in English, but in Hebrew, this is the same verse as when Joseph and all of his brothers died and this new king in Egypt rose up who didn't know Joseph. So this is that same kind of feeling. Everything was good while Joseph was alive, but then another king came and didn't know Joseph and everything fell apart. well, everything was fine when that generation knew everything that Yahweh had done, but when they were dead, nobody knew Yahweh anymore. So,
This faith wasn't passed on.
yeah, that's what's being implied. That it's not that, yeah, they didn't know Yahweh nor the work which he had done for Israel. So all those things that Yahweh was saying, teach your children this, tell your children about this, don't let them forget about this other thing. Teach them all about when you do celebrate the Passover, you'll do it like this. And when the children ask this, then you'll tell them about this story. They weren't doing that because they didn't know. These children didn't know the work which he'd done for Israel. I mean, clearly somebody knew because they did record it.
Yeah.
It got recorded and passed on enough, and all of this was an oral tradition long before it was written down. When Ralph sat down to write in the Babylonian time, he had a lot of oral tradition. He had a lot of sources. So he had various sources that had been written. But those sources in and of themselves would have been transmitted orally for a long time. So it was a very long time after this that Ralph was writing things down. So he had a lot of oral transmission. And when we think of oral transmission, a lot of times we think of like it's not as reliable because we want to.
Whispers type of stuff.
Yeah, we think that once it's written down, then you know it's safe. But actually, their view back then was the opposite because, for one thing, they didn't have a printing press.
Yeah.
And
Stone tablets were expensive.
yeah. Scribes were very meticulous. They were notoriously meticulous, but they did make mistakes. Most of them were very minor mistakes, and we can find them.
Either.
Yeah, and people couldn't read. Well, actually, the Hebrews probably were very literate. The Israelites were probably remarkably literate because it was their culture was predicated on the teach your children about Yahweh, teach your children the laws. I don't know. I haven't studied exactly when that came to be something that they enforced. It may have actually been during the exile that they really started pushing that, possibly. But when I think about the Hebrew people, I'm always in my mind. I'm always thinking about a people that are very, very literate. Even way back when nobody else was, they were, because that was part of their religion was to be literate and to be able to read scriptures. At least men, because they had to be able to read. That would have it probably would have been during the exile, because they had to learn to read so that they could read the scriptures in the synagogues, and that's how they kept their religion alive. Synagogues didn't come to be until they were carted off into captivity. But the other thing with the oral tradition is that a scribe writes something down. The scribe will sometimes make little errors, but when you get a writing, it's not. You don't necessarily know who that scribe was. When you get an oral tradition, if your dad tells you a story and says, this is the story, this is how it happened, you're more likely to believe him than if a stranger told you a story that was different and said, this is the story, this is how it happened. Because you have the authority of the person who is transmitting it behind it. So if the person who is transmitting it is a person that you respect, then the oral tradition has the authority of the person behind it, the authority and the reputation of the person behind it. Whereas a scribe doesn't have any inherent authority, reputation in what they're writing. So if they get it wrong, who's ever going to trace it back to them? Whoever's going to know that it was them who got it wrong. But if an oral tradition gets messed up, then it's clearly the fault of the transmitter, and their reputation is online. So they actually they actually held the oral traditions to be very true to form, that they didn't vary much. They had a lot of little tricks and stuff. When we get to the Song of Deborah in a couple of chapters, we're going to go through it pretty fast because Hebrew poetry kind of makes your head spin unless you're right into Hebrew grammar, which I'm not. And I'm assuming that you guys are not. But I mean, people spend their whole lives evaluating that poem because it's one of, if not the oldest text that we have. It's the oldest material. So yeah, it's, and it was transmitted orally for a very long time. Okay. I don't know how we got off on that tangent. My brain is a little bit scattered tonight. So probably, yeah. All right, verse 11. As long as we're not on a particular time constraint, we have to do the book of Judges by whatever date, then it's all good. All right, verse 11. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of Yahweh and served the Baals. So here we've got the opening statement of all the narratives. Every time that you have a new generation, the children of Israel do evil, and then God will have to raise up a judge. They forsook Yahweh, God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them. They bowed down to them, they provoked Yahweh to anger. They forsook Yahweh and served Baal and the Ashtoreth. There's three names, Ashtoreth, Asherah, and Astarte, all refer to the same goddess. They kind of use those words interchangeably in different translations, depending on which translation you're looking at. Might use any one or all three of those. But they're all...
What?
Huh?
Goddess of what?
She was the main consort of Baal. She's actually a fertility goddess, which tells you what was going on at all of her temples. She actually had the Asherah poles and trees where her shrines were usually at. But with that said, Baal and Asherah can actually refer to a multitude of actual gods, because it really just says that predominantly the Baals, the Baalim, were usually storm gods, mountain gods. It wasn't necessarily one particular god. The Baal of this place, this Canaanite tribe, might be a little bit different than the Baal of that Canaanite tribe. There was no unity, but they both called him Baal. They both called him God, and he might be a little bit different in each one. One might be god of the storm, one might be god of the mountain, but they'll call them both Baal, and they'll have similarities. Well, Asherah is the same way. She's usually a fertility goddess, but she may also occasionally be other related. Goddesses were usually fertility goddess or fertility or war, actually. There were goddesses of war. But usually they're fertility goddesses. The anger of Yahweh was hot against Israel, so he delivered them into the hands of plunderers who despoiled them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. And this is what we're about to read throughout the entire book. We've gone from the summary of everything that happened in Joshua to now we're looking at kind of a table of contents This is what you're going to read in this book now. The earliest judges are going to have trouble with their immediate neighbors in the southern hills, Aram, Moab, Philistia, the Canaanite coalition there. And then later their enemies are going to come from further away, so like the Midianites and the Ammonites. And then ultimately they're going to have problems inside of Israel itself in civil war. So verse 15, wherever they went out, the hand of Yahweh was against them for calamity, as Yahweh had said, and Yahweh had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed. Nevertheless, Yahweh raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. This verse is the only time where these people are actually referred to as judges. Noun, judges, in the book. Elsewhere, the noun judge only appears once, and it's actually a title of Yahweh. So the people judge as a verb, but they are not judges. In fact, they're more often saviors as far as their title. So that leads to the question of why call them judges. As I mentioned last class period, we think of judges and we think of that person who decides a case, right or wrong, you're guilty or you're not. And that's not really an accurate representation of what these guys are doing all throughout this book. There is a difference. They are more often saviors. The Shofatim usually are operating as saviors, which we'll talk about more in a minute. But in judging, if they're judging, they would be acting so as to uphold the covenant. So they are saying who's not upholding the covenant here. Are the people not upholding it, or is God not upholding it? And of course, we always know how that's going to... we always know what the answer to that is going to be. All right, verse 17. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but they played the harlot with other gods and bowed down to them.
So these guys like high in power, these judges, or they just...
Some of them can be, some of them not. Some of them are just lay people that, I mean, Deborah is actually a judge operating in that capacity. Gideon was just a soldier, an average soldier. He didn't have any particular power. So, yeah. In verse 17, they would not listen to their judges, but they played the harlot with other gods, bowed down to them. They turned quickly from the way which their fathers walked. In obeying the commandments of Yahweh, they did not do so. Play the harlot, quite literally, they were prostituting themselves in all the fertility rites and worship practices of pagan deities. And we could go on with that for quite a while, because there's an awful lot of things that when the Bible says things about sex, in particular, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, but more so in the Old Testament, it's more obvious because you have a narrative context. You have to discern whether it's saying something about sex as an act that happens between a consensual act that happens between a man and a woman, or whether it's saying sex as a form of worship. Because in our mind, we don't have sex as a form of worship as part of our society. So when we hear we read the Bible saying something about sex, we only have one way of thinking about it, and that is between two people. But you have to look at whenever the Bible starts talking about sex, you have to look at it and first define which type of sex are they talking about, because there are things that will be prohibited. Sex for worship is always prohibited. So if the Bible says don't do this, whatever this might be, don't do this, it may very well be saying that don't do this because this is what all of the people are doing to worship with their sex. And this is the kind of things that don't worship with your sex. Don't make sex into a form of worship. Don't do this. The Bible comes in over and over again and says, don't do this. Don't do this.
So even if you weren't specifically doing it for worship because all those other people are,
well, see, that's the question.
then it's like the culture. Like you don't want to be a part of what the culture's doing, even though you're not really doing it just hypothetically for that reason.
Yeah, and that's the question. That's the question, and how you apply those kind of things. Is it something that is it subject to the culture? Because, now, if the only reason that God was saying don't do X, Y, and Z is because that's what they do to worship with sex in pagan temples, if the only reason that God was saying don't do it is because of that, well, nowadays we don't use sex for pagan temple worship. So is that okay then in our culture today? Or is it still wrong even though we're doing it for a completely different reason? And that's where you get into the how you interpret the Bible, because you could argue it either way. That's why there's so much arguing today over things like homosexuality in the Bible, because homosexuality in the way that we think of it never existed then. It was never in their wildest dreams. Why would you ever do that? That's just not okay. However, they had homosexual sex going on in temple worship, in pagan temple worship all the time. So if that's where we got the sodomite idea, came out of worshiping a pagan god by means of having sex with a man. A man having sex with a man.
How did those thoughts come about? Though, like, to do that would be to worship, like these pagan gods. Like
They were worshiping fertility gods. They were worshiping fertility gods, and they would quite often send children to be prostitutes in the temple. And so they would, from a very young age, they would grow up in the temple, and that would be their life. They would be owned by the temple and the temple god. So, I mean, you had young girls, young boys, didn't really matter. They were all there available for sex. And people would come and they would do this. And it didn't really matter if they were boys or girls. They were owned by the god. And they were the means by which you connected with this god in that orgasmic bliss where you just feel like you're flying. That's where you encounter the deity, and that's how it feels to encounter a deity. So that's what they would use that for. So that was what they were meaning when they were saying, like when Paul goes on, because I mean, this didn't stop in the Old Testament. This is still going on in the Greek and Greco-Roman times. And so when Paul is talking about homosexuality in Romans, he's not talking about what we think of being as homosexuality. That doesn't mean that God is or is not okay with homosexuality today. I'm not making any kind of generalization on that. But I am saying that that's why there's so much argument where we can look at Romans and we can say, it's right there. It's in black and white. How do you not see it? How could you possibly argue it? How could you call yourself a Christian and look at that and not understand that that's exactly what he's saying? Well, it is. But he's talking about that. He's talking about what they would do in the temples. Because the idea that we have of a man and another man being in love and having sex was not something that ever entered into their minds.
It wasn't about love. It was about
No.
worship.
Yeah, in that sense, it was either about procreation or it was about worship and pleasure. Well, you had prostitutes too that were there for pleasure purposes, but like as far as being in a relationship, that was just for procreation. That was all that was supposed to be for. It was just procreation. For all your fun, you went to prostitutes, and for your worship, you went to the temple. And sometimes you skipped the prostitutes and just went to the temple for fun because it was always there and it was normal. Now, the Israelites were not supposed to be doing this. And God made it very clear that the Israelites are not supposed to be doing this, but their cultures all around them were. And Paul makes it very clear that Christians are not supposed to be doing this, but their culture all around them is doing this. And so that's what he's pointing out. So, if you do have strong opinions about homosexuality, you gotta find another place in the Bible, and I do think that they're there. I do think that there is very strong evidence that it's not what God intended, and it's not okay. But you can't just say, you can't responsibly just say, oh, well, it's right there in black and white. Romans says it. Paul made it right there. Because the context. And the first thing, anytime you read anything about sex, you have to look at it and say, what kind of sex are they talking about? Are they talking about something that a man and a woman do, or are they talking about it as a form of worship? Because if they're talking about it as a form of worship, it's bad. It doesn't matter what it is. It can be anything, and they're going to call it bad. And if it's something that a man and a woman do that looks like that, they're going to say it's bad. Don't do it. So, anyways, distracted again. Verse 18. And when Yahweh raised up judges for them, Yahweh was with the judge, and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For Yahweh was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed them and harassed them. Okay, so something's missing here. Yahweh is being moved to pity because they're groaning, all those who oppress them and harass them. But unlike back in the parallel that's being drawn with, Joseph died and then a new Pharaoh, and then and the new Pharaoh didn't know Joseph, and so he oppressed the people. What's missing in this account is that the people never cry out. Over in that story, the people cried out to Yahweh and said, help us, we're being oppressed. They never cry out here. They're just groaning. Verse 19, and it came to pass when the judge was dead.
Do you think that's because they didn't know him at all?
Well, this is our table of contents for what's going to happen throughout the book. So yeah, it does show the de-evolution of the people getting further and further away from knowing who Yahweh is. It came to pass when the judge was dead, they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers by following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. Then the anger of Yahweh was hot against Israel, and he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant which I commanded their fathers, and has not heeded my voice, I will also no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, so that through them I may test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of Yahweh to walk in them as their fathers kept them, or not. So the reason why Joshua didn't finish the conquest, which was the question that we asked at the beginning of last time, is not just because he got old and died. It was because God wouldn't let him, because he wanted to have these people here in order to test the Israelites. This little section, these couple of verses, is the oldest section of this chapter. And it actually brings to mind a session of the heavenly court. You know how in the book of Job you've got this courtroom set up, and you've got HaSatan there saying, Job, Yahweh saying, what about my servant Job? And HaSatan says, well, he wouldn't worship you if he didn't have it so easy. Not that whole thing going on. So we get this picture of this court. This court shows up all over the Old Testament in various different forms. And we see a glimpse of it here. It's a very, very, very old concept. Book of Job is very, very old. I would say that it's probably older. The book of Job is probably older than the Song of Deborah. Because I actually think that Moses picked up the book of Job in written form from passing people. So the book of Job is very, very old. This concept of the heavenly court is very old. And here we see God acting as a judge. This is not a burst of anger by Yahweh inviting somebody, i.e. Moses, Joshua, somebody, to talk him out of it. The way that, he says, oh, these stupid Israelites, I'm just going to kill them all and start all over again. And Moses says, oh, no, don't do that, because, your name, and people will think bad things. That's not this. This is a session in the heavenly court. So the words of Yahweh here are like the ruling of a judge. So the judge rules, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died. So I'm not going to make this easy anymore. So now there will be testing that is going to transpire. We have in this court, we have the likely presence of HaSatan.
That's Satan.
Yes. Satan, here we go, another tangent, but a good one. The idea of Satan, the idea that we have of Satan and the devil evolved a lot. And it changed a lot during the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Originally, this figure, Satan, whom I will refer to usually as HaSatan, Ha being the Hebrew word for the, so the Satan, the accuser. I refer to him usually as HaSatan because it kind of separates it in our brain from this evil destroyer who walks about like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. That's the picture that we have of Satan. And that's not necessarily the picture of him in this context of the Old Testament. HaSatan was somebody on the heavenly court, and this person or this figure, it could be a person, or it could be an angel. It could be a human being on the heavenly court. There is every reason to believe that there are actually human beings on the heavenly court, in the heavenly court. These particular human beings who have God's ear, possibly the martyrs, but the people who have the ability to testify and to influence God in the decisions that he will make by way of their relationship with him. Okay, so HaSatan it's an office, and it may actually be an office that can belong to various people on the heavenly council. It may be an office that's just held by one person, or it may be an office that can move. Different people believe it in different ways. But in either case, this HaSatan is not, in the Old Testament, inherently evil by any means. If he was evil, he would not be able to be in the heavenly court. How can something evil get that close to Almighty God and not be burned up? So there's no way that HaSatan can be the evil Satan devil figure that we see and think of later, which is not at all to say that that figure doesn't exist. Just to be clear, I'm not saying anything about that. The scripture is pretty clear that we do have an enemy. He does want to kill us. So this is not an argument that there's no enemy and there's not really evil, because there is. But this figure of HaSatan is God uses him. God uses this place. Now remember, all of these people that are on the council, they're all working towards a common goal of achieving God's will. They are achieving God's will for the world. They are achieving God's will for individual people. God's will for individual people may be, like with the case of Job. Job has maxed out where he's at. He can't get any more righteous. He can't understand anything more about me because he's completely maxed out for where he's at. I want to take him to a higher level of understanding me, God says. So, how do I do this? And then HaSatan steps up and says, so God says, have you considered my servant Job? And HaSatan steps up and says, well, he's never really been through anything bad. So quite possibly, that's why he's righteous. He's never really been through anything bad. So God does orchestrate all the bad things that happen with Job. He allows all those bad things to happen to Job for the purpose of growing Job into a new level of righteousness, where he can bless him over and above everything that he had been through before. So here we have his will is for the Israelites to come into a deeper relationship with him. So instead of Job, the individual, we have Israel, the nation. And so here in the heavenly court, we have Israel is going to be tested the way that Job was tested. HaSatan, go for it. Test Israel. And see if they will keep the ways of Yahweh. If they're going to do as their fathers did and keep the ways of Yahweh or not. So that's where you can see this as being a heavenly court scene, even though there's nothing but a few words of dialogue. There's no narrative given for the picture of the heavenly court. But with the wording that's used, you can see the presence of the one who's going to test Israel and put them through some bad stuff, which they're going to go through, and see if they will be faithful or not. All right. Verse 23, therefore Yahweh left those nations without driving them out immediately, nor did he deliver them into the hand of Joshua. All right, so yeah, he didn't do it so that he could use them by means of testing Israel. About the what I was saying about the devil and HaSatan.
Well, that makes sense what you're saying.
Yeah, they didn't have the Hebrews didn't have any place for this this singular godlike figure who represents the interests of evil and opposes Yahweh. That would have been blasphemous to them. You don't have a good God and a bad God in Genesis or anywhere in the Old Testament, but you have this figure called HaSatan that we talked about, a member of God's council. In his job, if you think about it like a courtroom, he brings grievances to God's attention, or he brings, he works on behalf of Yahweh to offer suggestions on how. He works in tandem with Yahweh to bring suggestions on how to accomplish God's will. So then God, the holy and righteous judge, has to rule on whether a person and or their actions are righteous or whether they're wicked. But there's never ever any indication that HaSatan is evil. During the intertestamental period, so after the Old Testament, before the New, suddenly the Jews were getting really interested in the nature of evil because bad things had happened. They'd been carted off to captivity. Some of them came back, but many of them did not. And the world was changing, and they're under this oppression, and now they have no temple, and then they have a temple again, but it's not the same, and they don't have a king, and they feel like, okay, now evil is real. We are convinced now there is something known as evil. Evil is real. And someone or something is always out to get us. And it's becoming part of their worldview that there's always someone or something out to get us. And they're starting to develop this idea against this backdrop of dualism. Dualism being that there's a good God and a bad God, and they're always fighting. And all of the religions of that area and that time all had the good God and the bad God. And they would fight. So they started to, they knew, they very firmly believed, okay, there's only one God. We are monotheistic. There can only be one God. But could all of this evil have a kingdom behind it, if not a king? Is it possible that there is a kingdom of evil like there is a kingdom of God? And the kingdom of God is not God. It's not a substitute for God himself. God's monotheism is not threatened by the idea of a kingdom of God. So monotheism wouldn't be threatened by a kingdom of evil either. And then out of that, you do get this idea of this king, but he's not actually a god. He's a king over this kingdom of evil. So they're very careful. And it is a very good question that they're asking, and it's surprising that it took them so long to ask it. Could all this evil have a kingdom? So they start looking back through all of their oral histories and their traditions. And then they start adding in their new theological views and their worldviews and their new revelations. And they, this is where you're getting all of the intertestamental literature being written down in what we call the pseudepigrapha. So they gather all of this stuff about evil and what evil was and what this evil kingdom is, and they throw it all together, and they come up with the figure of the Mastema in the Book of Jubilees. And the Mastema is an active opponent of all things good. He orchestrates temptations and persecutions and all sorts of evil, but he's still under the control of Yahweh. He's not... Yahweh's not at all threatened by him. But by the time that Jubilees is being written, HaSatan has become evil. He's no longer a member of the Divine Council. We're not hearing about him on the Divine Council anymore in this time period that they're writing. So the idea has shifted. And then out of that is where we see Jesus enter the scene. So Jesus enters the scene just after the writing of the intertestamental literature. And at the time of Jesus, there is an allowance for an evil figurehead, being this Mastema, as well as a plethora of what we call demons, who were just evil little minions who work for the figure of the Mastema. Because demons are mentioned in the Old Testament, but they're idols. They're idols. Specifically those to whom children are sacrificed. So the question then is when and how, the theological question, is when and how HaSatan and or Hamastema merged with the Greek diabolos. And diabolos is the Greek concept of the evil figure, who in Greek theology, Greek mindset, not even theology, but just their cultural mindset, the diabolos would have been a god. So we know that HaSatan is translated diabolos in the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, because the Septuagint was written in Greek. They took the Hebrew and they translated it into Greek because people needed to be able to read it in Greek as they started losing their Hebrew background, because Greek was the language of the day. So they translated it diabolos in the Septuagint, but whether or not Jesus ever saw the two as being the same is uncertain. And it is significant because Jesus was Jewish, and he talked to Jews, and he talked to HaSatan. As you remember, he had that whole temptation in the wilderness, and he talked to HaSatan.
Oh, that HaSatan. I thought that was Satan.
Yeah, well, it's Satan. It says, Satan is how we say HaSatan. Mm-hmm. In the Greek, it would have been diabolos. But unless they actually...
Did they change his name from Lucifer?
Oh no, Lucifer is a different thing altogether. I know. It's confusing.
That's good. It makes sense.
Be tempted by the devil. He's tempted by the devil. But I think he actually says... Away with you, Satan.
Mm.
Verse 10, let me see here in the Greek. Satana, yeah. Okay, so he calls him Satan. He calls him Satana in the Greek. So, yeah, he speaks to Satan. Which is interesting. He speaks to Satan. He speaks of the devil. He speaks of Diabolos. But he speaks to Satan.
Mm.
And of Diabolos, he says that it's this evil figure who's ultimately going to get destroyed in this lake of fire, which in and of itself is quite new and revolutionary imagery for Jesus' time.
Mm.
Because the lake of fire revelation also came out of the intertestamental period where they were, okay, so now we asked all these questions and we've determined there is such a thing as evil. There is really and truly evil. And there is an evil figure who is perpetrating all of this evil.
So didn't they know
Now
who he was
what?
before?
They didn't have any concept
They
of
didn't?
no, they did not have any concept of an evil figurehead who is causing bad things to happen. If good happens, God did it. If bad happens, God did it. God does everything. There's no evil. There's no bad God who's doing things. That
It's
comes.
funny because you just thought Adam and Eve, like from the very, very beginning, like they knew that there was good God, and then I suppose maybe they didn't even know what the serpent was. Maybe they weren't.
No, they didn't have knowledge of good and evil. That was the whole thing.
But after, did they realize who he was, who it was?
Well, do we know who it was? You know, this serpent. I mean, the only thing we really know about the serpent is that there was something really wrong with him. Apparently, why is he doing this? Well, he does have knowledge of good and evil.
And it seems like not.
But his knowledge,
not a normal animal, obviously. Normal animals don't have a mind like the serpent had.
yeah,
So was he possessed?
yeah,
Did
or
God make the snake and then he got possessed?
by what? The snake, the serpent. The serpent had knowledge of good and evil, and that made him different from everything else on the earth, including Adam and Eve. So he, like God, I suppose you'd say, had knowledge of good and evil. What I see in the creation story is that, yeah, the serpent is HaSatan. The serpent is Satan. But does that make him inherently evil? I would say no. Because he is the agent by which Adam and Eve, he's the agent by which bad things happen to Adam and Eve, and they do bad things.
God was testing them.
But what would have happened if Adam and Eve had not eaten of the tree, the knowledge of good and evil? What would have happened? Just think about it. You're God.
Happily ever after.
Okay. So you're God, and you say,
Boring, you know?
yeah, you're God, and you say, I wanna create this world, and so you create this world, and you put all of these happy people into it, and they live happily. Now, and granted, we don't know how long Adam and Eve were living in that garden before they decided to eat the knowledge of the good and evil. They were sitting in there chilling and eating the tree of life. They could have been doing it for thousands of years. I mean, theoretically.
Yeah.
We don't know how long they were in there. And at some point, it's like, okay.
Cut's like, this is boring.
Shake it up a
Let's
bit.
mix it up a bit.
There's a difference. I mean, he created man in his image. God created man to be like him. Well, and that's actually exactly what the serpent tempted Eve with. You'll be like God. Well, she's created in the image of God. Of course she wants to be like God. There is a big difference. I have a bit of a problem with the idea of the Garden of Eden as a failed experiment of God's. Because I think he always meant for it to happen. I think God always meant for the fall to happen. We didn't catch him off guard. We didn't do something that he went, oh no. He fully intended for it to happen. Because there is a big difference between being innocent and being righteous. God is righteous. When you're looking at righteousness as opposed to innocence, God is righteous and not innocent. Innocent carries with it, when it's opposed with righteousness, innocent carries with it this idea of naivete. How can a 2-year-old really sin? They don't. It's an infant. There's no knowledge of good and evil. Right about when they're 2 is when they start getting a knowledge of good and evil. But, an infant has no knowledge of good and evil. They just do. They have nothing. But sooner or later, you're God, and you get a little bit tired of living with infants who can't really relate to you and can't grow. They never grow up. They just stay as infants. Whereas somebody who is righteous, that tree was not the tree of ability to commit evil. It was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Once they had knowledge of good and evil, then they can then choose whether to be righteous or wicked. They can then choose which way they're going to go. And does that downplay the fact that they sinned? Well, no, they sinned, and that was bad. But I think we've put an awful lot of emphasis on it over the years that, if there just hadn't been a snake in the garden, then everything would be perfect. And, if only Eve hadn't taken that, everything would be perfect. And if only she hadn't taken it to Adam, then everything would be perfect. No.
I often wondered, what if Adam said no?
Me too.
Yeah. And that kind of gets you, that actually, I had a revelation when I was looking at that. I don't know how we got into Genesis, but okay, so there's sin. The two of them had, the way that God addresses them for their sin. Hang on. I'll actually read it because it's kind of cool. Okay. Okay. He said, this is Genesis 3:11. He, Yahweh, said, "Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree which I commanded you should not eat?" The man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the tree and I ate." Is this an excuse or a confession? Because the serpent deceived Eve, but nobody deceived Adam. Okay, so Yahweh, God, said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" The woman said, The serpent deceived me, and I ate. So Yahweh, God, said to the serpent, "All these bad things are going to happen to you because you did this." And to the woman he said, "I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. Pain you shall bring forth children," yada yada. Verse 17, then to Adam he said, "Because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat it," all of these bad things. Eve didn't get the "because you hearken to the serpent" line. When he talks to Eve, she doesn't get the "this is it." It's because you hearken to the voice. Adam's sin was in heeding the voice of his wife. What's going on? Why did he take that? What was his sin? Because we don't see him wanting to be like God. We see her sitting there with the serpent, and the serpent is saying, "Oh, this is good stuff. You should try this." And then the woman saw the tree was good for food. It was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise. So she took the fruit and ate. And then she gave it to her husband, and he ate. She doesn't transmit any of that to Adam. Why did he take the fruit, and what was his sin?
Because she did it, he wanted to do it too.
She did it, and he knows. Remember, she wasn't even there when God said, you should surely die. We assume that Adam told her, don't touch it. Don't even look at it. Don't go anywhere near it. Because I don't want anything bad to happen to you. So just don't go anywhere near it. So when she actually recounts to the serpent, "Oh, we can't go anywhere near that," she's saying more than what God actually said. So we assume that she got it from Adam. And Eve's sin, of course, is she believes the word of the serpent. She doesn't believe what God said. So she trusts the word of the serpent more than she trusts God. And so the lack of faith is her sin. It's not even so much the eating of the fruit. It's the lack of faith, believing what God said. Adam's sin, he takes the fruit from his wife and eats it. Why? He wasn't tempted by the serpent. It doesn't say that Eve tempted him. He doesn't necessarily want to be like God and have all of the desire to make one wise, but he didn't want to live in eternity without his wife. Because he knew God said, "You shall surely die." And he believed it. He didn't have a disbelief like Eve did. Eve didn't believe that she would surely die. Because the serpent told her and tempted her, and she said, "Oh, yeah, okay." But Adam knew. Adam realized God said, "You shall surely die." Oh my gosh, you ate that fruit. You're going to die. I don't want to live forever without you. And so his sin was actually choosing to be with his wife rather than choosing to live and walk with God in the garden. And this is called, anything you put above God is idolatry. Yeah. His sin was actually idolatry. Yep. Woo! Going back to the Satan thing. Actually, no. There it is.
Must have waited a long time to have kids then. You don't know how long they were there for. But obviously never aged. And she's like, "Why didn't they have any kids before?" Because God said be fruitful and multiply.
Mm.
Must be. Wow.
Yeah, and
Don't want any more stress yet.
and I mean, you do have the question of exactly how did they fill up the earth. It's a theological question. It's not really it's a practical question to which we don't have an answer. It's a practical question to which the writers of the Bible gave a theological answer. So you can't really use a theological answer for a practical question. Who are these people that Cain was afraid of when he says, oh, well, if you send me out, everybody's going to kill me. They're going to see me and they're going to kill me. Who's going to kill you? Your mom and dad? Like, who are these other people that you're afraid of? Where did these other people come from? Who did Cain and Seth marry? These different. Yeah.
That's so.
Yeah.
That's what I think from a scientific point of view. The gene pool was so untainted that was okay back then.
Yeah. The intertestamental literature actually has a bit in there about how Cain and Seth were both twins with girls, which I think is funny because the biblical text actually implies that Cain and Abel were twins. She has Cain, and then she conceives and bears a son and calls his name Cain, and then she bears a son and calls his name Abel. She doesn't conceive again. So it kind of implies loosely that Cain and Abel were actually twins. But yes, in order to answer the question of where did their wives come from, the intertestamental literature has them both be twins of women. But it still doesn't answer the question of who are all these people that Cain's afraid of.
Yeah.
Because Cain's afraid of all these people right after he kills Abel. And then off he goes. And actually, there's a woman, Alice Lindsay is her name, and she is a biblical anthropologist. She has her work cut out for her. She's a scientist and a Christian. She's an anthropologist and a Christian. And she actually has a moderately high view of Scripture. It's not. I have a slightly higher view of Scripture, but she and I would get along quite well. There's just a few parts where I think she takes a bit too much liberty in saying, "Now that didn't happen." When I would say, well, it's kind of there in black and white. You can't really argue that one. It really kind of says it right there. But she has a theory, a very, very good theory, actually. She discovered a naming pattern that I've been drawing on as I've been going through and doing the genealogy in the book of Genesis. I've been making a giant family tree in the genealogy, and I've been looking at all the intertestamental literature and stuff too to try to flesh this out, all the names of the women and whatnot. And she noticed something about the genealogies that she calls the cousin-wife naming prerogative. And she basically said that there is evidence, there is genetic and archaeological evidence that, and written evidence as well, that the tribes of Abraham's day, what they would do is they would have, if they held a significant amount of property, they'd have two wives. They would have one wife would be a sister wife, a half-sister usually. She would be the first wife, and she'd be the wife that you'd take when you're quite young. So the wife of your youth would be the sister wife. So Abraham, Sarah, his sister wife. So he has this sister wife and marries her quite young. And then late in life, when he is well established and his territory is now too big for him to manage by himself, he'll take a second wife. And he'll stick her on the southern border of his territory. So he'll have his sister wife on the northern border of his territory and his cousin wife on the southern border. So he'll have two completely different households with two completely different families running, and he'll alternate back and forth between the two. And that was traditionally how they did this. So we see this with Abraham. We have Sarah, the sister wife, and then we have Keturah, the cousin wife, who's mentioned later. That he actually waits until Sarah dies to take her as a wife. And then he sends her away and divorces her without giving her any kind of an inheritance. But that's another story. But he has his cousin wife or his sister wife and his cousin wife, and that this was the typical way of doing things. While the cousin wife, the firstborn son of the cousin wife would get his inheritance from her father. So his maternal grandfather rather than his own father. So his inheritance would come from his maternal grandfather. This would be good for people who had no sons, but they had daughters, because they could transfer their line. Their daughter's firstborn son would be considered their direct line. And the way that they would show this is that the cousin wife would name the firstborn son after the name of her father. So you can actually rebuild genealogies based on the name of the son. The name of the son would be the wife's father's name. Okay? So all of that, that Alice Lindsay, and she goes to quite great lengths to point this out, and I've worked for several months now on genealogies, and I can tell you, yes, it does actually bear out in the scripture when you're trying to make the genealogies. Oh my gosh, look at that. So this person is the heir of this person, then that's, the generation before, this is actually connected to this one. Quite interesting. Well, she points out that Seth and Cain both have sons whose name is connected to a single father, named Noach or Enoch or Enosh. All would have been the same word, same idea. So both Cain and Seth married daughters of a guy named Enoch. So who is Enoch? Because that ain't Adam and that ain't Eve. So who is Enoch? And you can get into all kinds of interesting theory. It ends up being it is a practical question to which we don't have an obvious answer in the Bible, because the Bible gives us a theological answer of the reason why we have the creation story is so that we can understand who God is. We can understand what God intended. We can understand what God did. It doesn't tell us how God did it in terms of science, and that's probably a good thing, because if it had been written in the science of their day, we would look at it and we would go, well, that's stupid. If it had been written prophetically in the science of our day, they wouldn't have understood a word of it. And 1,000 years from now, they'll be looking at it going, well, that's stupid. I mean, they just, it doesn't, it's not supposed to answer the practical question. It was never intended to answer the practical question of how did God create the world. It answers the question of why did God create the world. So yeah.
He could have created other humans.
He could have.
Adam.
Yeah. The Bible doesn't say that he did, or it doesn't say that he doesn't. It doesn't say at all. And you can get some really interesting theories when you start to wonder, okay, and this is kind of where I've been going with this. And the idea that what made Adam human? What was the definition of humanity? What made him human? As opposed to every other thing that God created.
His soul.
And his soul is evidence that he is created in the image of God. Because a being created in the image of God has a soul. Is it possible that, and this is purely my wondering, I would never try to argue this, is it possible that this soul, two human beings, Adam and Eve, have a baby, it is a human being? Is it possible that there were other human-like creatures on the earth, via evolution or whatever else? There were other human-like creatures that could procreate with human beings, which we do have biblical evidence for. But they were not human, because they lacked a human soul. They lacked being God-breathed, God being created in the image of God. So maybe they evolved, but they were not human because they were not created by God in his own image. But when they procreated with a being that was created in the image of God and did have a human soul, their child would have a human soul that they inherited from the one who was created in the image of God. And if that happened, sooner or later, we're all descendant. We've all come somewhere along the line. We have encountered the genetics from Adam and Eve. But is it possible that evolution was at work as well as creation? And that they both coincided? Because the problem that I have with evolution is the fact that it's a theological problem that I have with evolution. I have a problem with the idea that something gave birth to Adam and it wasn't human.
Something evolves from nothing.
Yeah.
Like, yes, I reckon de-evolution, for sure, but not evolution.
I can even see God, because the creation, the creative evolutionists, there's a whole camp of creative evolutionists that say, yes, God created the world. He did it through evolution. Okay. Except, if God created the world through evolution, it means that something gave birth to Adam. And that's where I have a problem with it. How does Adam, created in the image of God, exist as a baby being raised by a something that's not human? Until he gets to the point of when he's older and he can walk with God and have a relationship with God. At what point do human beings get a soul, I guess is the question. If you look at it through creative evolution, God created the world, yes, he did it through evolution. Like you can say with the Big Bang. You know, the Big Bang and the theory of creation, the theory of the Big Bang and creation are not incongruent. God said it and bang, it happened. You know, it's that Big Bang. It went bang because God said. But evolution's not quite the same way, because you have this very hard problem of what makes a human being a human being. And where did the human being get its humanity if we all just happened by a process of accidents? Oh, God ordained accidents. You say God ordained it. So, okay, it's not an accident anymore. It's God ordained. But at what point did we become human beings? And that's why creative evolutionism doesn't work for me. But the idea that God created Adam and Eve and made them in his image and gave them a soul and had personal relationship with them. Therefore, they were different from everything else that walked on the face of the earth. But there were other beings that walked on the face of the earth that were not in the image of God. And they did adopt this idea of human beings procreating with angels, of all things, in intertestamental literature, and they took it back into Genesis, where they were saying, the sons of God and the daughters of men. Intertestamental literature goes back and looks at that and says, those were angels or demons or whatever it was that they were procreating with human beings. Which, yeah. But the idea is there, at least in Scripture. It leaves room for the idea of a human and a non-human producing offspring, and it just makes you wonder.
It would have to be compatible, because obviously different breeds of dogs can create the crossbreeds, but a dog and a cat cannot.
Yeah.
Because they are different species.
Yeah.
Although the angel, but I didn't even think that they had physical DNA.
No.
So I don't understand. Like, I've heard that theory as well, and it kind of makes sense as a theory. But if they don't have physical DNA that matches up with humans.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it's there explicitly in the text by any stretch of the imagination in Genesis. But when you do get to the intertestamental period, when they're asking the question of evil, what is evil? Where is evil coming from? How do we have evil in the world? They didn't take it back to Genesis because they were comfortable with Genesis and the story in the garden. They don't see that.
Made other Adams and other Eves and just not thought important to tell us about it.
Yeah. Yep.
Why wouldn't you? Why couldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, there's definitely other beings in existence. So yeah, God created them.
Did you not say human beings, just beings?
For
Became scared of.
Oh, he just said all men. When men see me, they'll kill me. Anyone who sees me will kill me. So who is this anyone that you're afraid of? But yeah.
Really, the Bible just highlighted Jesus' story, genealogy, where he comes from.
Yeah.
But then we're all supposed to be descended from Adam and Eve. So if there's these other beings.
Well, even so, by this time, we've been around as human beings for quite some time now, regardless of how long you want to take it. If you want to just take it at a bare minimum of 6,000 years, which the Bible never says. The Bible never once says that the earth is 6,000 years old. But even if you want to take that theory and say the earth is only 6,000 years old, that's an awful lot of generations to intermingle and mix. So Adam and Eve's DNA is gotten around to all of us. Every human being on this earth has Adam and Eve's DNA in them. That's not hard to envision 6,000 years down the track. And certainly if it's several million years down the track, that DNA got dispersed into everybody, everywhere. So, well, we did quite the the tour.